participating in this event. And in case you have any questions, please do indicate, and then we will be ready to take your questions as well if there is any at the appropriate time. So introduce you to this particular event and why this work has started. Actually, there is a lot of requests coming that developing countries parties are, especially developing countries parties, are in need of understanding what are the impacts of mitigation measures which are being taken while we are heading towards low carbon economy. And in this particular case, there are some impacts which probably need to be managed. This is more about managing these impacts which we are receiving so that we all are heading to a sustainable development objective while we are also mitigating the emissions which are we are trying to address in a long run. So in this particular aspect, in order to meet this demand or this gap of tools and methods available to understand these impacts so that policy actions can be more informed, we conducted this study. And this particular study was done with a view to demonstrate it is not really taking exactly the policies which have been designed by countries as of now. So it's more like taking an example and show like a toolkit what can be done using these tools and what we can understand, what kind of analysis it can provide to us, and we can customize it more with the involvement of all of you so that we know what your needs are. So this is only an example to show. And once we understand that and demonstrate that this is what can be done, you can use it further in your analysis and in your policy plannings. Once again, this analysis was done for Senegal and Kenya, and there are some aspects when we consider these two countries, which is mainly related to data availability in these two countries, because as we understand that data availability in developing countries, especially in Africa region, is very difficult and very challenging. And it was very hard for us in support of our consultants that finding a country where data is available. Because idea behind this study was not to generate the data, but to show what can be done if the data is available. So that is why the decision was that let's take a country where we have a minimum amount of data where we can start on and demonstrate, rather than data accumulation exercise, which was not really the objective of this study. So with this, I would introduce here that we have our two consultants who worked on this study, and I would say that this work was done by very able people who are sitting here, who have long years of experience bring with them to do this work. We have Scott McDonald, who is from Nottingham, PhD from Nottingham and Edinburgh School of Agriculture. He has been a consultant to governments of developing economies, to World Bank, to OECD, UNECA, FAO, ILO. So it's endless list which he brings with him, consulting different organizations in his area of his expertise, which is in modeling, economic modeling. Then we have our second speaker here, which is Lindsay on my right. She's economist as well for 20 years of experience in economic modeling, specifically in CGE models. Her main area of interest here is impacts of implementation of response measures and sustainable development goals, and impacts on global economic trends. I think she has a very long experience in working on SDGs, and that is what she brought in this particular example, how the impacts of response measures can integrate with sustainable development goals as well, because I think this is the objective for all of us, that we are achieving towards sustainable development goals while we are also addressing mitigation actions. We also have here one of our colleague, Manal, who was part of this study as well, and she was also undertaking work collaboratively in this particular project, and she's here to give more insights in this if there are any questions coming from the area she worked on in this particular project. So with no further delay, I would like to give the mic to Scott and to present you the results from this preliminary study we have undertaken. Thank you.
Welcome. title on here, Developing of a Toolkit for Assessment of Impacts of Implementation and Response Measures, a pilot study. It's not the pilot study, we emphasize. I've followed a well-established pattern of mine in getting 3 competent women to do most of the hard work so that I can stand up at the front and claim most of the credit, which seems to be a well-established practice. Hopefully, we can present something that will give you some insight. I will basically start by talking about some of the parameters relating to this type of toolkit. We will then go on to look at the global analysis of response measures, and then we'll look at the implications that come down to Kenya and particularly Senegal. We could do more, but this is a long report that's available from the UN. We've actually got some memory sticks with the report on and various other bits and pieces for those who like goodies when they're at conferences. Okay, so what's this situation? The inspiration, it was the development of a toolkit. It's not the toolkit, we should have had an A in there, for analyzing the impacts of response measures. And it was specifically a pilot study. The intention was an illustration of the information that could be gained from this type of analysis. This type of model we've used, a CG model, we call it CG, but it's verging on to being an integrated assessment model. And essentially the difference between CG and integrated assessment models is the extent to which you have climate effects providing feedbacks within the model. And it was funded by the UNFCCC Secretariat. So what's the analytical method we're going to follow? We're going to link a global model with a single country model. And it's important to understand why we'd want to link them. With any of these models, there are constraints. So with a global model, we're not going to be able to get at the nuanced detail that's relevant at the single country level. So by linking the models, we can get the virtues of both of them, those that capture the cross-border and international effects coming from the global study, and those that capture the detailed issues arriving at the individual country level, such as income distribution, the implications for labor markets, etc. And to do that, we've used a globe model called Cge, which was conditioned as a variant of an existing model for this study, and we linked that to a single country model called Sdgs. These are essentially long-time collaborations with myself and Karen Thierfelder. The shock we're going to run is highly stylized. We're not trying to simulate exactly what would happen in climate change negotiations. If we were running this in detail for a particular issue, we would be looking at what might happen in more nuanced circumstances. But for the purposes of illustration, this works. We're going to hit a 20% reduction in CO2 emissions as the response measure. And what we're after picking up is what are the domestic and cross-border impacts for participating countries. And then we're going to pick up the cross-border impacts for non-participating countries. So what we've done in here is we treated the low-income and small island economies as non-participating in the reductions, the response measures. There are limitations, and it's limited in 5 ways. The models used were simplified variants of existing models, quite deliberately to keep this within sensible budget constraints. The analyses were limited to using models in comparative static mode rather than recursive dynamic mode. These models are conditioned to be run in either. The range of global response measures were limited deliberately. The evaluation of different mitigation policies was not part of the study, so we were not sitting there trying to analyze how countries might respond to the response measures. And the project was constrained to operate with pre-existing databases. The point with many of these works is it's the data that's expensive, not the models. So what's the analytical method we use? They're computable general equilibrium models with compound energy production systems. We only looked at CO2 emissions in there, but the model is conditioned to work with multiple different types of greenhouse gases. It's just what's fed into it is the data that's relevant for that. And then we're going to link them. And here's where we start. We run with the GTAP database version 10, which came out in 2019, which refers to 2014. That's actually relatively up to date for this type of data. And the single country models uses 2 social accounting matrices that were prepared by a team at the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission. which we knew a lot about the quality of that data, we knew where the weaknesses were, and we could talk with the data constructors to identify where there were any problems. The other thing that needs to be remembered is these are deductive models. They're theory with numbers. They're set up as laboratories to explore issues, options, instruments. They're not here to tell you what the future is. We try to avoid the messianic complex as far as we can with these work. So the important thing to realize is these are analytical models, not forecasts. What are the constraints we're facing particularly? We have imperfect knowledge. We don't know what new technologies they're going to be. We can do some speculation, we can put some information in to try and look at different options with technologies, but we don't know what those technologies are, and moreover, we don't believe there's a magic technology tree. We only look at CO2 in this, but we could look at other greenhouse gases, including NOx. And the other thing to remember is economic systems are complex. The point of any model is to try and distill that complexity out so that we can get down to the bare bones of the issue. Go back and read Joan Robinson on that. They are data intensive, these models. They do require complete and consistent databases, which puts quite strong constraints. But we only work with databases that are SNA compliant. So any national accounting system that chooses to follow the UN system of national accounts should be able to provide the data to support this type of model. We put satellite accounts in. You'll find those listed in the UNFCCC, so we've got information on quantities of energy used, the relationship of the emissions per unit quantity in different applications. We do face a problem with the availability of data. That will become particularly relevant when we get onto the global analysis. And the other one we face is a problem of human capacity. This is not about people being capable. The truth of the matter is the people who do this work, and I'm about to insult my colleagues here, we're kind of odd. We're not really normal people in one sense of it. We tend to get fun playing computer games, so we're a bit sad like that. But the important point to come out of here is an observation by Box. Essentially, all models are wrong. The point is some are useful. A word here about the difference if we use dynamics, recursive dynamics versus comparative statics. The point is we've got a base starting point here. If we go through to the final year, this may be where we'd have ended up if there had been no shock, no effective policy, no response measures. What we're interested in is the difference between this point here and this point here. In other words, trying to identify the effect of that policy in isolation from other things. In many contexts, we can work out where point B is in a comparative static format, and then we don't need to bother with the recursive dynamics. However, point B can be a consequence of the path. So if we introduce response measures now, we're likely to have a very different time path, and B is likely to be in a very different point than if we decide that we can wait until we're all fried. So it's important to realize that. So a lot of the time, comparative statics gives you more information than people like to think, and they want to see the idea come through that way. Okay. So how's this going to work? There's a whole lot of work that goes around at the back here, where you've got background, and you've got defined policy shocks. This needs serious input by the countries concerned. It's vastly underestimated. Countries seem to think we can get a consultant along, and they can do all this work for you. I wouldn't trust a consultant to change the battery on my car. At that point, we get into this area here, and that's where the technicians come in, and that's what we are. We're technicians. We're not decision makers. We're going to take the global data, we're going to take the pilot country data, and we're going to work out the policy shock data that's required to influence and to replicate the information coming from the policymakers. We'll run that down into the global model, and the results, in this context, world price changes and exchange rates, will then be fed into the pilot country models. At that point, we can run the simulations. And then we can come out with some sort of guidance on policy implications. And the result indicators we come out with include some SDGs. The other side up here is all sorts of stuff that should be there. Documentation. Many of these models are poorly documented. We don't think that's good practice. And training and training materials tend to be thin on the ground. But it takes time. So what did we do with the global analysis? We used the model GLOBE or INARIS, whichever thing. We used GTAP version 10 and we aggregated it up, which you basically have to do for all these studies. We did not keep Kenya and Senegal as single countries. Why not? This sounds odd because both Kenya and Senegal are individual countries in the GTAP database. Why? Because we don't think the data is reliable. We conclude that if we aggregate the regions of West and East Africa, we get a better representation of what's likely to apply in those cases. Why is the data not reliable? Many of the African countries aren't producing the data. So what's happening is there's a degree of guesswork going on in putting this global database together. So what were the basis of the simulations was a 45% reduction in CO2 emissions for 1.5 degrees centigrade. But all the IPC pathways include emission reductions from multiple measures. So what we're going to do is we're going to take an approximate 20% reduction. Well, 20% isn't approximate to it. We're going to take exactly a 20% reduction by market mechanisms. Then we're going to get into the results and the implications. This is a standard chart that comes around many times. I've put the arrow on the EU 27. This is not because I'm opposed to the EU, because I'm British. This is simply because if you look at global shares of emissions, you get one picture. If you look at, so the EU's up here. If you look at shares per capita, the EU's in the middle. If you look at per GDP, EU's down low. However, in these two situations, low-income and developing countries are virtually emitting nothing. Truth of the matter is, I suspect if we built 10 new coal-fired power stations in the developed world, we got 10 years in which we didn't build 10 new coal-fired stations in the developed world. We've got 10 years in which these low-income developing countries don't need to worry about emissions. So when we're going to shock this, we're not going to have these very low-income countries reducing their emissions at all. The 20% reduction in global emissions is going to come from the rest of the world. You might not like that, but that's what we did. Okay, so we ran it with 4 different mechanisms. The first one was standard carbon taxes. So we're going to reduce carbon taxes by putting a carbon tax on. And that's going to be a uniform carbon tax for every country in the world. Again, you might think that we could run a more nuanced experiment. Yes, we could. We're going to keep the internal balance and the external balance fixed so there's no increasing debts. And we're going to keep government and expenditure consistent so there's no reduction in social programs. And we're going to keep investment fixed so that there's no reduction in future capital generation. The second one we're going to do is we're going to put a tax on the fossil fuels. So we're going to tax the quantity of fossil fuel used, not the emissions. So it's an indirect way of getting at the emissions. Much the same thing's going to go on with the closures there. The others we're going to put on is a simple quantity restriction. We're going to simply restrict the quantity of carbon-emitting fossil fuels used. Bang. Done, to achieve the 20%. And it's going to be tied to what happened with the first experiment. And the fourth experiment is an illustration of what would happen for technology change. We were basically saying, by how much would technology in the electricity industry have to change in terms of emissions to achieve that 20% reduction? We're not going to talk about A3 and A4 here. They're all in the report. I don't know about you. I've got a date with a meal later. So we probably don't want to spend too long on it. Okay, so the tax on carbon is per ton of CO2 emitted. The tax on fossil fuels is the tax per ton of fossil fuel purchased by different agents. So what happens to emissions by region for the 2 different ones? The ones in blue, the bars in blue, are for the carbon tax. The bars in brown are for the energy input tax. And you can see there's substantial differences across countries to achieve it. SACU gets hammered all the time. It's going to get hit. SACU gets hit even harder if you go to emissions, high on the carbon taxes. Why? Because SACU is high emissions per ton of energy input used. And that's why you're getting the bigger hit on CO2 tax than you're getting on the energy tax. Those countries where it's a lesser case, which I'm desperately trying to find one, there it is, NAFTA. Good Lord, I found something that America does better than others. They're in the situation where they're actually slightly cleaner in terms, so that's why the carbon tax is less penal to the Americans. What happens to GDP? Okay, all these systems are constrained optimization. So as soon as I'm going to put a tax in on emissions, I'm going to be putting an extra constraint in the system. If I put an extra constraint in the system, I'm going to see a shrinkage in economic activity in all these economic models. Unless someone's got a magic technology tree going on there, this is going to happen in all these models. Anybody who tells you these models won't have this effect, if you increase the constraints on the system, don't pay them. So what's going to happen? We're going to get very big differences in the impacts on GDP. But notice here, this is the bit we want to come across. These are your low-income countries that were excluded from engagement with it. They're also getting hit. Why? Because the global economy shrunk. And therefore, they're going to take a hit because other countries have shrunk. There's going to be less trade engagement with them. There's going to be cross-border effects. And those can't be avoided. You are going to get some countries that are going to be exceedingly unhappy if it's an input tax. Russia in particular, the former Soviet Union, China, Brazil. But the noticeable thing to come from here is, even if you don't make the cuts, you're going to pay a price. And if you do make the cuts, it's going to depend upon the structure on your economic system, how big those penalties are. What we got here is all these items in green, highlighted in green down here, they're all the cross-border impacts. These are the areas that were excluded from the emissions reductions. They're all suffering and seeing some reduction in CO2 emissions, except the odd little one, Central America, that for patterns of trade, patterns of international relations, it doesn't impact on them so much. This is a big one, exchange rate movements. What's going to happen is these exchange rates are going to move. Now, in this case, in this type of model, it's the price of foreign currency. So if the bar is above zero, it means a depreciation. And what we're going to get in our low-income countries is quite substantial exchange rate depreciation. Now, there's a little trick floating around in here that on average, the average exchange rate, the weighted average exchange rate's unchanged. So these are all movements around. Why is that looking odd here? Well, we've got these big rich people up here who are getting an appreciating exchange rate. And they're big economies relative to other ones, so they've got a bigger weight in the basket. But the important point to realize is NAFTA, EU, high-income Asia, India, China, and Brazil, to a certain extent, in some circumstances, are going to see appreciating exchange rates. Lesson that comes out of here, at this end of the thing, we're talking about, in general, the less well-off countries, and they're going to see a depreciation in the exchange rate. That's going to make imports more expensive, and their exports will actually become slightly more competitive on international markets. So what's this here? What we've got here is the price changes, and this, of course, is the type of slide you should never present because it's unreadable. But these are all the commodities we had in there, but what I've done is I've put in red anything that's negative, and in black anything that's positive. Now what you're seeing here is the import prices before the exchange rate effect, for all these countries, all these commodities is going down for East Africa, and these are the ones for West Africa. Where there's a yellow highlighting on there, the absolute price change is greater for West Africa than East Africa. And the point to get over here is quite simply, it matters where you are in the world, it matters who you trade with, it matters the quantities of you trade, and it matters the goods you trade in. So this is going to depend on where in the world you are and how you're interacting with other countries. So why did we choose West Africa and East Africa? Why did we choose Kenya and Senegal? We knew this before we started. We knew that this would give us a good illustration of how your interactions with the rest of the world will impact upon the effect of response measures on your economic system. So, those exchange rate and price results are the ones that are handed down to the single country study. Lindsay will deal with that, talk first a little bit about Kenya and Senegal, and then in more detail about Senegal.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone, and such a pleasure to see you here after 18 months of presenting to very small screens where I can't see people. It's wonderful to see you, so thank you for taking your time this evening. I'm going to walk you through the single country component of the toolkit, and we're going to start with that by actually taking a step back. When we think about the impact of the implementation of response measures, we can consider that that may have many different types of impact. It may be impacts that cross scope, economic, social, and environmental impacts. They may cross different domains, both domestically and cross-border. And they may have different signs. There may be positive impacts, negative, or it may be a combination, a mixed effect. And it may arise through different pathways. These effects may be transmitted around the world via capital markets, goods markets, and changes in natural and human resources. So for this pilot study, we use this toolkit, but I wanted to mention at the start that the toolkit that we have can cover different types of impact. And within this particular application, we looked at cross-border economic impacts that arise through the goods pathway. So that's specifically through changes in trade, as Scott was showing. Let's also step back even further, and it seems a silly point to make at COP26, but we're in the context of limiting global temperature rise. This is the goal, to have climate mitigation policies that are effective and that bring about at least a 1.5 degree climate situation. However, within this frame, we must remember the Article 410 of the UNFCCC, which says that we must take into consideration the situation of parties with economies that are vulnerable to the adverse effects of the implementation of the measures of responses to climate change. Following the Katowice decisions, that we must minimize adverse impacts and maximize positive impacts. So let's start our journey through the single country part. As Scott talked about, we use a combined global and single country model where we are looking to capture changes in global economic conditions that arise from these policies and see how they trickle down and impact countries that may not themselves be participating. By using a single country model, we can include a lot more country detail, things that are specific to that economy, and we can also develop country-level indicators, which is particularly desirable when you're thinking about the SDGs. In terms of country selection, Scott and Kusum have already mentioned that there was demands around having good data availability, and that's what led us to Senegal and Kenya. But it's important to say that those countries have different economic structures, different energy use, which we would expect in themselves to lead to different impacts. A simple look at the trade openness of the two countries see that they're very different. Senegal, it has a 62% of GDP trade openness, whereas Kenya has 36%. So we can already see that there's a difference in the global integration with global markets. So the toolkit itself, as Scott's already introduced, has single country computable general equilibrium models. So these are whole economy models. And for those of you that have done economics at any level way in the past, you'll remember the circular flow of income, where the income and purchases travel around the economy. And that's what we're looking to capture, because then we can look at higher order effects. So not just the initial effect of a particular change, but also how that ripples through the economy. So the Stage CC model is linked to the global model. And again, it's run in comparative static mode, which, as you'll see when we get to the results, this means that we have the base value, so the starting value, and then we have the value of whatever we're looking at, say GDP, for each of the 3 policies that we're considering. And that's how we can isolate the likely impact of each particular policy. Both models are based on social accounting matrix data, and I've given you the year of 2014 and the sources there. And the toolkit provides for us a wide range of results, much more than we can even imagine to introduce to you today, but we want to give you a flavor of that. And there are headline and detailed economic results, household level results, which are very valuable in helping us to identify any particularly vulnerable households that may lose out from mitigation policies, even those that are occurring in other countries, and selected sustainable development goal indicators as well. So that's work that hasn't been done before, to our knowledge, where we're looking at response measures and the impact on progress towards SDGs in other countries. So a little bit on how we actually take the information from the global model down to the country level. As Scott says, we first run the global model with the 3 simulations that we talked about. And from those results, we extract 3 things. If you recall, we're talking about the goods pathway. So we're talking about changes in trade. So we're talking about changes in world import prices, world export prices, and the exchange rate effects that Scott was highlighting earlier. We then match those to the single country model. And that's important because it's not always the case that products within a particular country are represented at the global level as well. So that's an area where we would very much work with local researchers, local government members, to check that we're giving an accurate linkage to the global market there. And then the final stage is to run the Stage CC model. And when the outcome of that is the impacts of the implementation of response measures in these countries. Just to recall, there are 3 policies that we're considering: carbon taxes, energy input use taxes, and quantity restrictions. So, possibly a slide that nobody wants to see late on a Monday, but I'll walk you through it. So what I'm trying to give you here is a sense of the big picture results. So the top half of the table, oh yeah, it's going to work, gives you the global results, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means for each of the countries further down here. You'll see, of course, that West Africa is matched to Senegal, East Africa to Kenya. So what we see under the 3 policies, carbon tax, energy input use taxes, and quantity restrictions, is a general fall in export prices across all 3 policies, with a slightly more extreme effect for for West Africa compared to East Africa. On the import price side, we also see a fall in world prices, except under the quantity restriction simulation. So we're seeing changes in world prices arise because of the introduction of these policies in other countries. Crucially, so many of the studies so far tend to stop at that point, but what they don't account for is the effect on the exchange rate, as Scott was showing earlier. And importantly, there is a depreciation that is caused from those effects that actually change the sign of the effect. Because of course, for exporters within Senegal and within Kenya, they face their domestic export price. They don't face the world price because there's also the exchange rate as a wedge between the 2. So what we see is actually a rising price for exports and for imports and a falling price under the quantity restriction scenario, and this becomes important later on. So just to give you a flavour of kind of the big picture stuff, lower world prices, but generally higher domestic trade prices, and of course these are average effects. If we look at this slide, we might think, oh, but there's not much action there, or we wouldn't expect to see much difference between the two countries. But of course, as we saw before, they have very different degrees of openness, different degrees of patterns of trade in terms of products and trading partners, and all of those are captured within the toolkit. So, we're heading now towards the results, and I want to take you on a journey through the results. We've talked about the impact on the trade prices. That's the starting point. In modelling terms, it's what we call the shock. And what we're going to go through is a set of steps which are going to lead us towards the likely impact on vulnerable households. So we're going to start with supply and demand, moving on to the demand for factors, rural-urban households, finishing up with vulnerable households. So let's start with some headline figures. So this is work done with Manal, who's sat at the other end, who did the Kenya work. And this is just a headline thing of the impact of response measures on GDP and welfare. So two big headline numbers. And when we look at this, recall that these are policies that are not implemented in these countries, they're implemented in other countries and then filtered through to these countries. And we see that GDP and welfare are lower under all scenarios. We see that the smallest effect is a carbon tax, and that's something we'll come back to later as well. And the effect for Senegal is larger than Kenya, which fits with the trade openness that we talked about earlier. If we add on a few more details, we can look at what's happening to the structure of the economy. So we can see that the economies are getting smaller, but actually there's a lot of structural change that's going on within the economy as well. Because we can see from this that there's a huge export growth, led by these higher export prices, led by the depreciation. So there's a big push within the economy to produce more exports, but we know that demand within the economy is falling. So there's a shift towards export markets and away from supplying domestic markets. So as I mentioned, a toolkit produces many, many results. And what's one of the strengths of the toolkit is that it can be tailored to the particular question that you might have or the particular thing that you're investigating, because we can focus on different parts depending on the question at hand. But let's look a little bit more in detail in Senegal about what's happening. In terms of commodity demand, so we know that overall demand, GDP, is falling, but we can see that that's sectorally, there's a shift that's going on. So we can see that agriculture, for at least carbon taxes and energy use taxes, is rising, and also slightly for manufacturing, but services is contracting strongly. Yeah. So we see agricultural demand growth. But on the production side, we can see there's a strong growth in manufacturing and some growth in agriculture. So again, we can trace this back to the boost to exports that's coming through the depreciation effect. So in order to produce, producers need different factors of production. They need land and labour and capital. And so what we can look at is the factor return, so the prices, the wages and the rental rates that are going to these, because this tells us about the demand for those factors within the economy. And this turns out to be very important for what's happening to the rural poor within the country. What you'll notice, I'll start here, is that labour of all types is going down in terms of wages. So there's a shedding of labour that's happening within the economy. But agricultural capital and land, certainly under the first two simulations, is going up. So there's an increased demand for that. These two factors are the ones that are tied into agriculture, so they can't easily jump into another sector. And because agriculture is growing, there's also demand for the factors that are used within that sector. And how does that filter into household incomes? You might think that with falling GDP, that everyone would be worse off. But what we can see here is that there's actually some nuance that's going on here with the rural and the urban split. And we can see that these higher payments to land and agricultural capital are actually providing a boost to the incomes of the rural population within Senegal, who are significantly poorer than their urban counterparts. But urban households who do not own those factors are losing out as wages fall. So to some extent, there's a buffering of the impact on the rural poor within Senegal. So this is where we've been. We've looked at trade prices, supply and demand for factors, rural-urban household income, and now we make the final step to look at really what's happening at the household level. And this really isn't a graph that anyone wants to see on a Monday night, but I promise you I'll walk you through it. So what we've got across the top is we've got annual household expenditure per capita in the base, so before any policies have taken place. So households on this side are poorer, and households up here are richer. On the y-axis, we've got the percentage change in household consumption, obviously with those above the line being the winners and those below the line being the losers. There's a key here to the type of households on the right. So because we show the results for each simulation, each of the three policies, each household, for example, urban north, has a value here for carbon tax, one down here for energy input use taxes, and one here for quantity restrictions. So each household has 3 dots, if you like. So when we looked before, we saw that there was some increase in rural household incomes. However, we can see from this more detailed analysis that it's not all rural households that win out. It's actually only 2 of the households under 2 of the policies. Recall again that this is cross-border impacts. These are not policies that are implemented within Senegal. These are the knock-on effects through global markets. And all other households are losing out here. But let's have a look at whether we can say anything about whether the policies are, quotes, less bad than the other. And we could do that by clustering. So the blue oval here clusters the results of the carbon tax simulation. So what you can see is that the richer households are slightly worse off than the poorer households here, and that the effect is quite muted compared to the other scenarios. For example, if we look here at energy input use taxes, we can see the much stronger effect. Again, slightly richer households are worse off, but it's a much steeper effect, a much stronger effect. And finally, for quantity restrictions, we can see here that it's very similar in pattern to the carbon tax, but of a much greater magnitude. So a conclusion from this slide is that household impacts depend on the type of response measures implemented in other countries. So, onto my first love, which is the modelling of Sdgs. And I won't spend too much time on that because I'm sure we're heading towards the end of time and ready for questions. But I wanted to give you a feeling of the kind of work that we can do on SDG indicators through this toolkit. So as part of this study, we looked at 3 SDGs, SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth, 9 on industry, innovation and infrastructure, and 10 on reduced inequalities. And there's much more detail of this in the report. but what I've done here is just given you a heat map to show where there is progress towards a goal and where there is regression away from that goal as a result of the introduction of these policies in other countries. You can see that anything in blue is progress, with the stronger showing a greater progress, and anything in orange is a regression away from that goal or the indicator used to measure that goal. Now, when you first kind of look at this heat map for carbon taxes, energy input use taxes, and quantity restrictions, you might kind of conclude that it's mixed. You know, there's some go up, some go down, but we need to take a closer look at what's going on. Because for sure, under the quantity restriction, we see some improvements to the environmental indicator, domestic material consumption, which is the use of raw materials, as we would expect to see. But really, under the carbon tax and energy input use taxes, the only improvement occurs in terms of the manufacturing value-added share. So there's a structural change towards manufacturing, which is in the SDGs as a desirable goal for sustainable development. However, it occurs within a smaller economy in all cases. Moreover, if we look at SDG 10, which is to do with household income and the impact on households within the country, we can see for all three policies, there's a movement away from that goal, which obviously is not desirable. So, onto the summary and a bit of a talk about applying the toolkit. So we can say that we've presented today an available toolkit for the assessment of the impacts of response measures using 3 stylized climate mitigation policies, both at the global and country level, which has given us a broad range of results. As I say, there are many more in the report and many more in the toolkit as well. The idea is to inform decision-making, to identify opportunities to maximize positive impacts of response measures, and to see where additional policies may be needed to mitigate any negative impacts. The findings of the work in the global part is that technological change in electricity production will have different impacts on different regions, and dirty producers will have to adjust more. For example, SACU, South Africa, which is dependent on burning dirty coal in old power stations. When we look at the cross-border impacts, we see evidence of cross-border impacts through the analysis. We find that they are mixed in sign, but a closer look shows that they are broadly negative, and that they are of notable magnitude. We were seeing some quite large changes there. Of course, all of this is in the context of necessary climate mitigation policies. This is, you know, it's easy to look at this and think, oh, it's all negative, but it's more about mitigating any negative effects so that we can move forward with good mitigation policies worldwide. And we find from the research that a tax on carbon is more efficient than a tax on fossil fuels, in the sense that it brings about less variation in GDP and household consumption. Right, I'll pass back to Scott now for some comments on some challenges. Thank you.
We need to go on to the next one. Where are the challenges that occur in this type of work? The obvious one that sits there is data. It's always a challenge. But in actual fact, it's often exaggerated the problems with data. Those who are old enough to remember the development of national accounts, which I'm probably one of the few people in the room reaching that age, they were designed and the put together in the UNA system of national accounts was designed to support empirical economic models. And the legacy of Stone is that if you follow the SNA system that was essentially his insight, then the challenge of putting together the data sets is not as great as it's asserted to be. There are challenges, but I would also suggest that there are substantial benefits of putting that sort of data together in terms of a better understanding of your economic system. a better ability to engage in international negotiations about climate change, trade policy, whatever. I would suggest at the moment there's an urgency, particularly with climate change. I don't think we can sit around, twiddle our thumbs for a decade pretending that it's going to go away. There are issues with the economic features of economies and economic behaviors. We do not or cannot capture in their full gamut behavioral features of agents in economic systems. We're not good at picking up when they have preference shifts, when their preferences change, how their preferences change. And there are some challenges of linking a global data set to a single country data set, because in a global data set, you're trying to get something that is reasonably approximate for all countries within the data set, whereas in the single country set, you're trying to get something that gives you detailed information at the single country level, and then linking them together can become difficult. The toolkit we've looked at here is applicable to any country with available data. The data can be collected and can be compiled if there's a will. It's certainly extendable to cover many more impacts: combined domestic and cross-border effects, different domestic response measures, different domestic attempts to mitigate the impacts of different response measures. We can broaden this out to pick up wider social and economic implications. For instance, development of a malaria vaccine will have substantial implications for economies like Ghana, feeding through into labor productivity. On the other hand, climate change might have really nasty implications for countries like Ethiopia, because malaria and tsetse flies will move further up the hill and therefore massively affect large percentages of the population that are living at altitude. We can pick up and integrate some of those effects. We can pick up more complex mitigation policies and other transmissions pathways. The other thing that's sitting with this toolkit is there's been a recent development with the software that's used for this type of analytical method to allow an interactive interface where policymakers can sit and use sliders on a screen to get overview of what's coming out of it. I'm not convinced that it's necessarily the right way to go, but policymakers do like to feel as though they're in charge. But the important thing with this type of interactive tool is to give policymakers confidence that the analysts aren't telling them stories that aren't true and that they can't see the effects of. One of the things that people talk about these toolkits, because they perceive them as complex, is ultimately they're mathematical models. If you can't explain why you get the results from that model, don't pay the consultant. If the consultant can't tell you why they've got this result, they shouldn't be paid, because ultimately all these effects can be explained because they're based on very explicit, very concrete mathematical models. That's the end of what we have to say. Now it's your turn to sort of have a go at us. Kusum.
So thank you for giving this insights of the work which has been done and presenting results coming from Kenya and Senegal, which definitely shows how different households in different levels of their incomes are impacted by these policies which are being implemented in countries not in Kenya or Senegal, and cross-border impacts are coming to these countries. I would like to open the floor now to our audiences in case they have any questions to ask, and then I will take it from there. Yes, sir.
For those of us who get lost after a while in the details of the economics, in plain English, what is the implications for distributive justice? What's happening to the poor? I seem to recall that generally there is a contraction of real GDP, of incomes. The bottom 40% suffers. Is that the bottom line? Either way you look at it.
Say something on that.
But in that context, I am a little puzzled by your use of the term efficiency. That, you know, taxes are more efficient than if the bottom 50% is getting poorer and labor gets less share, and, you know, consumption falls in the bottom 40%. It may be efficient, but in what sense? So what? So could you just explain
Absolutely.
that?
Absolutely. Yeah, the result is that all but 2 households are losing out. The 2 that are, let's say, winners are 2 particular rural households within Senegal, but everyone else experiences a lower consumption. So we're not in a you know, a winning world, if you like. The phrase efficient tax instruments are very kind of economist phrase, unfortunately, not very happy. It's more of a kind of least bad situation. One of the things that does come out of the Senegal work is that often in this kind of analysis, we see the poor hit more than the richer households. And in this case, although almost everyone is losing out, the urban households are losing out more because they're buffered by this impact on agriculture through land and agricultural capital. I'm guessing, Scott, you might like to say something about the efficiency question.
The distributive justice is, I think, probably the most important single issue that comes out of these type of analyses. It probably won't surprise most people. It certainly wouldn't surprise development economists who follow the first law of development economics: unto those that hath shall be given, unto those that hath not shall be taken away, even that they hath. Some of the understanding of why it adversely impacts particularly on poorer households, and particularly in this case, poorer urban households, is in actual fact the downturn in wage rates, etc., comes about because of the way the economy is shifting back to agriculture, which lowers average wage rates. It also is the second side effect that's going on in here, is that the prices of goods that these households purchase are on average rising. And it's very often the case that poorer households are actually more energy intensive in their consumption patterns than richer households. So as soon as we start doing things that have strange and adverse effects on energy prices, it's often the poor that suffer particularly badly. And you know, we tend to get confused because we see all these people driving around what we call Chelsea tractors, you know, these big 4x4 SUVs. And we think, oh, they must be spending an awful lot of money, when we see the poor driving around, if you're in Ethiopia, in old Ladas. But in actual fact, it often a bigger proportion of their expenditures going there. So they tend to get hit with the double whammy. And yes, I would argue that in almost all these policy shocks we're going into, I would be surprised if we can find ones that on average make the poor better off. Sorry, that's probably not news that people want to hear.
So I have a couple of questions. The first one is, why use CGE? Why not something like input-output analysis, for example? Wouldn't that provide, since you're not doing a dynamic recursive CGE and you're looking at static impacts, wouldn't it provide some advantages in terms of tracing back the impacts in terms of what goods and commodities are traded and where sort of how the impact sort of flows through? What are the multiplier impact effects, for example, of a particular policy? Wouldn't that be more useful? That is the first question. The second one, How much of this is dependent on how you construct the baseline, since the policy shock is from a baseline? What does the world look like in the baseline itself? Do we have decreasing inequalities in the baseline? Do we have increasing incomes across countries in the baseline? Do we have simple extrapolation from the past in the baseline? Do we have more fossil fuel use, for example, in developing countries in the baseline? And the third question is that if you have, for example, then moving on from your results, can one sort of say that there is a particular way then that the NG taxes that are collected through these kinds of policies, that there's a particular way that they should be put back into the economy, so that we mitigate the impacts of the kind of impacts that you see on distributive justice.
So I think first Manal wanted to say something, and then
I don't think, oh, my microphone's working. Hello everyone, delighted to be with you. Just following up on the earlier question of justice, I think also we have to remember that the results when it comes to specific households also vary by country. So the results that Lindsay was presenting was from Senegal, but the Kenya results, for example, when we look at the share of manufacturing, that actually improves across the for SDG 9, so we see more of improvement there. So the structure of the economy by itself will actually drive the details of the results. But what is also a key importance of this kind of modeling work is that it allows the policymakers to say, all right, if this is the effect of response measures in other countries on our poor, what then could be kind of mitigation policies that they could design domestically to address this particular effect. And then they could, consider things like retraining, for example, or what we call just transition measures that could very specifically be targeted to the poor. And those then because they're able to see the effects of external response measures on their economies, then they can react to them. And that is the way that then policymakers basically can reduce this injustice effect as well. So that's, and those kind of policies, as a matter of fact, can be also tested in this kind of a model as well, in addition to the response measures that were tested here. Some response measures within any kind of a government can also be tested within the toolkit. And that's it. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to Scott.
Right. First of all, can I deal with the DSGE first? Dynamic stochastic general equilibriums are based on macroeconomic theory. They notionally have what they call some micro foundations, but even my macroeconomists blush when they describe that. Essentially, dynamic stochastic GE models are inductive models. So they rely on a presumption of regularity, which makes them difficult models to use to analyze this type of shock where you want to get at nuanced details at multiple households. Now, input, output, and CG models can basically run off identical database. I can take our social accounting database and I can run an IO model on it. And, it's trivial. Why would I choose CG over IO? The standard IO model assumes that relative prices do not change. I have a slight problem with putting a carbon tax into a system when I'm going to assume that relative prices don't change, because the IO model is assuming that's not going to happen. I can trace all the linkages in the CG model in exactly the same way I can trace the linkages in an IO model. So I don't have a problem with that. The other problem I have with an IO model is the presumption of excess capacity. So nearly all IO models will exogenize certain accounts, the quantity of effective demand, etc., factor supplies. And there is a problem then when you get into the boundaries between the SNA's production boundary and the general boundary that IO can't pick up on of labor movements. So IO models don't actually give me a good play on labor movements. If I run the CG model, which is essentially microeconomic foundations like the IO model, in a recursive dynamic mode, then I can start picking up things like, what if I increase expenditure on research and development so that I can bring new technologies in without having to assume that there's a magic technology tree? What happens if I start putting more investment into education and training, into healthcare, etc.? I can pick all those up in the recursive dynamic mode. One of the reasons that the CGE helps in that context is because I'm going to allow price changes to move. I can allow for exchange rates to move. And the cross-border effects are going to come through trade in goods and services, exchange rate effects, international transfers. So I need that to be able to pick up those effects. For instance, large aid payments coming into a country are going to cause an appreciation in the exchange rate. That can damage the competitive position of an economy. You know, so there's that. Baseline is always an issue. It's always a frightening one. Because if I'm going to try and project forward into the future, I'm starting to get into the area where the imperfection of my knowledge becomes problematic. I tend not to know a lot about the future. So we can look at past trends and assume they might continue to form our baseline. But essentially with these models, what we look at is not the absolutes, but we look at the changes relative to the baseline. So good analysis in this will look at the sensitivity of the baseline projections to presumptions about the underlying trends. So we can cover some of that, but let us not beat around the bush. Baselines in dynamic models are sensitive. You raised the point of double dividend. Can we put in a more efficient tax instrument? Sorry, I've used the economist word efficient again. Can we put in a more efficient tax instrument and therefore we get a double dividend because we get a more efficient tax instrument because we're taxing directly the pollutant, and that allows us to redistribute down the line? In some of these cases, there are double dividends, but remember, if I redistribute down the line, I'm going to be taking effectively from the poor and moving it to the rich. At that point, I want the policymaker putting in saying what their preferences are. Because we're technologists, we're technicians, nothing else. It's not our job to define or determine the income distribution policies of governments. What we can do is we can examine what would happen and what would be the consequences of different redistribution packages. And by that, you can give policymakers much more information about the options they have to mitigate the adverse effects on the poorest in society. And there will be where I will play with a double dividend. You know, trying to avoid getting into this sort of messianic phase that I can tell people what's best for them. You know, I do know that if they did what I told them to do, they'd all be happier. But unfortunately, that's not quite how the world works.
So,
Stunned them into silence.
So considering it's a Monday evening, I think you did a brilliant presentation, so thanks for that. So my question is, you made a comparison between databases and models, or models used, and said that databases are more expensive or costly. Can you just elaborate on that?
Is this me again?
It's you.
Yeah, right. Okay. Right. Essentially, if you put together a database which is SNA compliant, I can customize these models relatively quickly to run with that database because they're set-based languages. Now, unless you want me to change the behavioral relations in the model, it's a relatively low-cost job to get a model running with a slightly different database or a different database, provided it complies to certain accounting rules. The problem with the databases is I need household income and expenditure surveys. I need labor force surveys. I need censuses of manufacturing, censuses of agriculture, censuses of services. I need commodity-specific trade data, typically at some HS level, 4 or 6 HS level. A lot of data. I need information about the tax incidence on different commodities. I need information about the different tax instruments. So there's a very large process of gathering primary data. Now, in actual fact, if you go into an awful lot of lower income countries, they're actually gathering a lot of that data. And that's an expensive exercise. The last thing anybody in a resource-constrained situation wants to do is pay some overpaid Western expert to come and do that work. Not only don't we know and understand the economy, we're damned expensive. The process becomes problematic because you have to bring all this data together in a way that's complete and consistent. And we have all sorts of problems with complete and consistent. Consistent means the expenditure on a particular item is equal to the income to that particular item. Yep, that account. Complete means that we have a complete representation of the economy. Consistency is largely mathematical. Complete is an understanding of the economy. But here's where we get problems. People lie. Men always tell you they're drinking less than they're drinking. They always tell you they're less than they're smoking. So what you have to do is you have to bring together information about the supply of tobacco products to the economy with demand for it and reconcile the differences between them. That's not always straightforward. It takes time, it takes application, it takes understanding of the economy, and it takes intimate knowledge of the surveys. And part of the problem with surveys is who answers the survey questions? Ethiopia has really nice surveys. They actually ask specifically, who's the major decision maker in the household? And they don't distinguish between whether it's male or female, they look for the most person. Rather than saying, the head of the household's the man. So, understanding and knowledge about the economy and the questionnaires you've asked is kind of important because there's a number of subjective judgments that have to be taken in there. And that takes time and effort and understanding of your economy. So it's time intensive. And you need people who are doing this on an ongoing basis. Bear in mind, most developed countries do not produce input-output tables more than every decade. One of the reasons we dropped using input-output tables and using supply and use tables is under the SNA, you're supposed to produce these annually. And we might as well avoid having to go into a linear transformation of the data. And then we made some assumptions, and then that gets embedded in our model, but sufficiently far down that we can ignore it. So that's why data is the issue. A more important point, I would argue, beyond that about why countries interested in this should be controlling their own data is the separation between data and model. In its simplest form, you could use our databases for an input-output analysis quite happily. It's a linear programming problem. But if you've got separation between data and model, then multiple people can run different models off the same database. And that way, you're not dependent upon the expert. You can go out and choose, and you can move around the experts, but because you control the data, you control what's going on. And that's why I would push for the data and domestic control of the data being important. But it is expensive in terms of time. Sorry, a long answer.
Thank you. I can see that there's a lot of interest and you have a lot of queries. Definitely it was a very interesting study. And I'm sure all of you got some insights of like how countries are being impacted positively and negatively. As we understand, there are both positive and negative impacts, and especially we are talking about how can we address negative impacts on these households which are impacted. And we got a very interesting question, really the money which has been collected by these taxes and how it can feed to address these kind of impacts in a longer run as we go, so that we can manage these impacts. I am sure that similar studies can be done for other countries as well, because we saw very evidently each country is different and different policies, that is why impacting them very differently, and one solution does not give the solution to everyone, so nothing fits for all. And we are looking forward to further studies in similar manner in other countries as well. So with this, since our timing is running out and it is sharp 45 and we need to close this event, but feel free to reach us and our experts here who can probably answer your queries in future to go. Thank you everyone for your interest and being there for us and listening to this work which has been conducted to help all of you. Thank you.